on this discussion about digital history. Even the New York Times is talking about digital history, right? So, I think Milano's next big idea in history is data from that article.
Yeah, a couple of things about that article. I made the mistake of reading all of the comments on this. You should never, ever read comments on this paper. It's bad for the blood pressure. But there was an enormous amount of antagonism and skepticism expressed in those comments. The humanities are losing everything that's important to them if they start to do digital things. Just silly, I think. Digital is a tool. It's a tool for understanding. It's a tool for outreach. And you do it wherever it seems like the right way to reach an audience or to understand an issue. It's not something that you don't do because it somehow seems mechanical or difficult. It's just, on the one hand, another way of doing your work. And it's been interesting with the students in the program. I think it's fair to say that the first class of students 5 years ago was sort of against digital work. They didn't want anything to do with it. It's changed a little bit, but there's still some resistance to it. People don't go into history and the humanities thinking, and yes, I'll get to do some really interesting programming as part of this, programming in the computer sense. They want to do other kinds of programming. I've been pushing it more and more, that it is clearly a skill that everyone needs to have in the humanities. It won't be the only thing people do. It won't be necessarily the defining part of their work, but it's a tool that opens things up, both as using that as a technique, but also as a new way of thinking about things. The example that I like to give is the whole notion of Web 2.0, the new paradigm of you're not just about teaching people by providing information, providing material for them to read, but you're interacting with them. They're co-curating the exhibits. Now, let's say we applied Web 2.0 to everything we do in the museum. It turns out, this is putting my history of technology hat on, the technology always comes after the culture anyway. It just sometimes becomes a lot more obvious. So the notion of doing public curating in spaces in the museum was gaining steam in the 90s before Web 2.0 happened. But with Web 2.0, it's very obvious what you can do now. So one of the favorite projects at the John Nicholas Brown Center, the Public Humanities Center, one that really opened my eyes in significant ways, is a project, community history project on the community, working class community right next to Brown, a community called Fox Point, where the center's been working with local historians, enthusiastic historians, but local people, amateurs, who have been collecting photos for years. Family photos, and people were throwing them out when people died, you get their photos. And he had all these images, and we're talking about thousands of them at this point. And the students helped him put them all up on Flickr and said, they're open, comment on them. Make, add notes, add tags, show when you know people, add their names. And I said, being old-fashioned with this sort of stuff at first, the audience you're after are mostly people in their 60s and 70s and 80s. These are, at this point, mostly Cape Verdean. It is not a group that is going to be out there with their computers looking at Flickr. And I was completely wrong, I have to say. After every funeral, this is an old bunch, more people would hear about this, people from all over the country, and you start getting comments, and you go through and say, "There's Joe. I saw him last in 1947. And, it's so great to see a picture of him." And this community came together around this Flickr site in fascinating ways. And so they did the work. We provided an infrastructure. We let them do the hard work of curating and of finding the information that we never could have found. But between the students and the community working together, they co-curated this quite amazing site. It turned into an exhibition. It turned into an elementary school program of teaching kids to do oral histories. became this enormously interesting community project, but based first on letting the people into the site to work with each other and to curate their own history.
I'm interested that you point out that your students at first were resistant to doing digital history, and I wonder if you think that's something of a trend, where resistance comes from within the academy more than it does from outside.
I don't know if it's a trend. Certainly history departments, which are the departments I know best, are slow to change. You know, universities are conservative places in many ways when it comes to their own work. Professors spend a long time learning how to do what they do, and they get rewarded for keep doing it well. They don't always get rewarded for doing new and different things. It did surprise me with the students. There's this whole literature out there about the notion of digital natives, which are, young people are supposed to just take to this stuff, which turns out not to really be true when you look at real life. Or it becomes that it's so native, it's so natural that it doesn't seem interesting anymore. Well, of course everybody's on Facebook. Why should we think about using Facebooks in exhibits? Why should we think about using Facebook in a way that is unusual or different, or that brings in new audiences? One of my students, one of my colleagues, wants to do a new kind of museum where he says, this is silly. Museums are putting objects on the web as catalogs. We just give every object in the museum a Facebook page. And then they can friend each other, and people can friend the objects. This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. But in fact, it's sort of interesting once you start thinking of objects as things that you can friend. We may try that, I don't know. But it is this notion that it does take a new way of thinking about things, and it may come from people who are far into Facebook. If you grew up with it, that won't make any sense to you. If you are, if you've grown up never thinking about it, it may be hard to get into it. So we may be at this interesting point where interesting things can happen.
Shifting away from the digital, I think something that's so remarkable about your career is how consistently you've had a foot in both the academic world and the museum world. Not that I don't want to build the wall between the two too powerfully, but I wonder if you could reflect on how those experiences compare.
Yeah, it's just an interesting question. People ask me all the time, well, why did you leave the Smithsonian to go to Brown? Another question I always get is, well, which is harder? Which makes you work more, the Smithsonian or Brown? And of course, they're so different. And the Smithsonian is an odd sort of very academic museum, so it's not quite a fair comparison. The work is very different. I think it's only fair to say that I'm working harder at Brown than I did at the Smithsonian. Partly it's a question of the Smithsonian in some ways is more, the work is more directly focused. So there's, at the Smithsonian, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. What you see when you go to visit the place are the exhibitions. They're the main public product. There's programs around them, but that sort of people go there and they think of the place as exhibits. Behind the scenes, there's all the other work that curators do, which is the collecting and the research, working with a range of people in organizations. So there's some academic work as part of that. And when you have an exhibit, you know, it focuses the mind. You have a deadline, it opens on a particular day. It might be 5 years out, but you know what you've got to do to make that, to do that work. And you are judged on how is the exhibit, does it work? Was it get done on time? Did you meet your budget? Those sort of practical kinds of things. At the university, or in a public humanities center at a university, you are judged, you're doing several things at the same time that are not necessarily, they don't go well together. So one of the things that I think is very important for students in this kind of program is that they do work that has a real product, and that they do work in groups. So the typical academic history course you go in the library, you write your paper by yourself, you turn it into the professor, nobody else ever sees it again. That's the kind of work you're taught to do, which is not much of what work in the real world actually looks like. So I want my students to do work in groups with an opening date that the exhibit has to be done by. There will be a public there. The people that they worked with will be there to see the work that they've done about them. It's a very different sense. But on the other hand, what makes it hard is they're still learning. What they're there for, and the fundamental purpose of teaching of any program at a university is to teach students things. And so you have these two very different aims that can frankly drive you crazy as a professor. You want to get the students to learn as much as they can, but on the other hand, there's a public that's coming in expecting professional work, and where the professor fits in that, how you make that, how you decide when to just let it go and when to say, nope, I gotta fix this, is really tough. So I do find myself doing more work on that. The other thing is that to teach well takes as much time as you're willing to give it. It's the number of, the Brown notion of education is what Brown likes to call boutique education. It's special for every student. And every undergraduate at Brown just assumes that you are there full-time to make him or her happy and to provide that education. And there's a sense that they're entitled to your time. They're paying lots of money for the program. They ought to have that. And so that's sort of what takes a lot of time. So that's why it's hard to learn.
Well, looking at your resume and thinking about what you've done over the years, it's hard not to see you as somebody who's constantly successful. And I wonder if you could share with us some examples of not being successful in the museum. And what that looks like.
All the projects that I tried to push through the Smithsonian that never happened. I mean, there's different levels of that. But the 5 years or so before leaving the Smithsonian, I spent a good 5 years on an exhibit project that was going to explain what the museum was to the public, which I still think, if anybody's listening, I still think the museum needs to have that. This was the Legacies project. The notion is, and I think it's true, although I guess in the end I could never convince the director or the potential funders that it's true, that the museum needed an introduction that would say, here's what American history is all about, as told through objects. It needed some sort of timeline that made sense of American history. It needed to explain to visitors how to use a museum. What do you do when you go into a museum? How do you look at objects? What's the point of it? How do you understand what's going on? And it needed a way of saying, here's what else you'll see is in the museum. Here's how to understand what you're about to get into. So American history, how to look at objects, introduction to the museum. And it never happened. It's not there yet. And for a whole bunch of reasons. One is trying to get a museum staff to agree on American history in 20 objects, or whatever we were going to aim at, is really hard. We went round and round on it. We had lots of interesting ideas. We never could get that to happen. Trying to convince the public that there's a way of understanding material culture that they should know and they would understand the museum better. Couldn't get that to happen. And then trying to explain the American History Museum to anybody is hard. It's really hard. And so maybe that was just a doing from the beginning. So it never happened. So that's fair. We did get a book out of it. We sort of took a lot of the research we had done, the co-curator and I, and we did turn it into a book. It was sort of included a lot of that. We made a website out of some of it.